All right. So this case is Friendswood, and this is another in our series today of kind of difficult clients. And again, with this client, part of the reason was that they simply did not lay all this down and know what it is beforehand. And saying that, so then it was kind of nice for us to help them lead through this. So this case was about construction delay, as we see a lot of times, and some of the terms happen a lot of times in construction delay that we do. And one of the ideas is a lay down yard, and that's the physical place on construction site where the pieces are put before they get assembled. And it has to be well coordinated, because space is almost always limited. And, first you have to bring in the beams before you can put up the floor joists or whatever, right? So everything's got to be in order, and it's all got to be planned out. And when there's a delay, if there's not room in the yard and you can't bring in a certain thing, then that thing can't get put on the job site. So now that's delayed. And then, as you guys know, that delays everything else that follows it. So this particular piece is about the critical equipment needed that we see over here. And here's the big list of the critical equipment. The location where it was being stored, and more importantly, who had custody of it. And then this is actually the site that they're trying to build. Now, the idea of who has custody of it is important on this, because part of the reason was, or part of the argument was, hey, we couldn't have built this any faster because you guys didn't get us the proper stuff. And we're saying no. In fact, we had all the critical equipment ready, and we were working on all the critical equipment, and you guys had custody of it for far too long. So the minute it's in your custody, it's in your custody. You need to get it over to the place and assemble it. And when it's in your custody, if it's broken or not working or needs repaired, you're the one that knows that, because it's in your custody. So that's what this whole thing is saying. So what we have is a couple elements, and I'll start the first one. I doubt it's probably animating very well. But now that we're into it, you can see that along the bottom here is going to be a timeline of events. This box here is going to describe what's happening, and then an animation can show where this critical equipment is at what time. And then as we go through, we kind of see the equipment move around. So it starts February 8th, and then also on February 8th, this piece moves over, the ductwork arrived. Now, as we're going through this, a lot of the names of these pieces and a lot of the dates of when they arrived and where they arrived were not known to the client, and they were just trying to figure it out. So every time I would tell them, hey, client, we need to get a final list of when these things moved, when the dates were, all that kind of stuff. We need to get that before we start. And every time they'd give me the final list of what it was, of course, it wasn't a final list. Then they would find that, oh, no, that wasn't on the 11th. That didn't move till the 15th. And as you can see, as we build these things, if I have to change the date here of February 15th, not only do I have to change everything that moves here, I got to make sure everything will still fit in this place. I've got to make sure my dates can still fit down here. I've got to make sure all this changes. And then, of course, that changes in every single frame all the way through the rest of the piece, right? If I had to move that number 6 before, then that number 6 has to be moved here, and then it has to be moved in this next frame, and so on and so on and so on and so on, all the way through the piece. So each time they made one of these changes, it was a rework of the whole piece. And so we constantly told them, please give us all of your changes at once. Please make sure all of the dates are correct at once. It got towards the end of the thing, it appeared to me, or I realized that the client did not have like a Gary spreadsheet of all the dates and all the changes. And so they were just flying by the seat of their pants. And there was one point where they had started commenting on a piece that was like 5 versions old, and I knew very well that some of the data had already changed. So once I figured that out, then I stopped production on this piece, and I wrote up that spreadsheet. And then I handed him the spreadsheet. Hey, is this really it? Are these the things and the dates? You got to tell me. And then, of course, it was, yes, here you go. This is, thank you for this great list. Here's the list, and here's all the things. Only then, of course, the next day to have it all change again. And add on new stuff and these whole categories here below, those were all much later add-ons, which means that once they added those on, if I wanted to keep my list over here, I had to move the timeline over. Originally, this timeline was across the whole bottom, and it was nice and within this area, and you can see where originally we wanted to have a space down here for the timeline, but of course that got changed, and unless we would have done a whole rework and start over, we just kind of went with it. So anyways, at the end, I think the piece works great. It really does start telling this long story about the original, here you can see the original air inlet silencers were no good. We had to get new air inlet silencers, way down here. Now, this was owned by the owner. This was, owned by this company called Ethos, and then this is, our original pieces. And you can see as it goes, now, there's one date that doesn't fit with everything else, and that's when the permit was issued by the city of Houston. So as we build the timeline, that kind of October 26th sits in the middle, and that's when we got the permit. But as you can see, as it goes forward, now finally, April 19th, we're starting to move the stuff over. So they, begin installation. And then as it starts going into installation, you can finally see why we have these crazy shaped boxes, because they actually go over and fit on the blueprint, which was the start of the whole idea here. The whole idea was that we'd make these Lego pieces that would fit on the original blueprint, and we could just track them through the process. Most of them became just boxes, but, I think it still works pretty well. And, you can just continue to see it move over. And I would say probably the one big difference that I would do now is, and we should do this with every single timeline, and that is go ahead and get everything out in a list form first. Because in a list form, you can see the dates, and you can see duplicate dates, and you can start putting them in order. One of the problems here is that they were giving me data that was not in order sequentially, so that, if a piece started on day 1 and then later in the thing it jumps all the way to day 5, we can make that change. But then to change that back to day 1 again or day 2, again, you have to go back and change everything from that point forward. So I'll just kind of go through the end of this, and we'll get to the final punchline.
It's interesting, Steve. That has a lot of parallels with the Leidos job I'm doing. We're doing the same kind of things. When do parts arrive, and when were they ready to be installed? We're doing it.
Oh, yeah.
It has a lot of parallels. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And even
see, and then
Mitsubishi,
we
for
got
that
to
matter.
the end here, and we realized that, yeah.
Yeah, this actually presents a whole new genre of graphics. It's, the construction delay of when was stuff delivered, when was it installed. We got 3 jobs that have that same feature right now.
Right. So then at the end here, you can say, well, look how messy this whole thing was. Look how many dates were involved. Look at the span of time. And then we can go into this very last piece, so now this shows all the critical equipment, when it was in their custody, and when it was installed. And then you can see how many days for each of these critical pieces basically was a storage length. So if they're storing our parts for 500 days, then obviously that's not keeping on the original schedule that we had. And this clearly shows that that schedule wasn't our fault. You had the pieces. It's not like we were holding on to the pieces and not giving them to you. It's not like the pieces were unavailable. You had them for, 32 days, anywhere from a month to years. So this is the kind of final wrap-up piece.
Yeah.
Nice piece.
Steve, wasn't the equipment was being moved from a site in Florida to Houston? Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think so. So then you had this idea of taking it down, and at the end they were trying to say, well, it took you far too long to disassemble it. And we were like, no, we had it disassembled, and in fact it was in your custody. So then if they said, well, when you disassembled it, you broke the bolts, we could say, well, yes, but part of the contract was you were supposed to check the bolts. And again, you had the thing for 2 days or 2 years, before you figured out the bolts were bad. And so that's kind of where this all went.
And this was used for a AAA arbitration in the Houston area between the two parties. And then Steve and Michael also did a Kronos, what was it called? Pre-permit delay. So this was one of the pieces that they used.
What's AAA?
Yeah.
Oh, American Arbitration Association.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's just a
not quite
domestic
major
arbitration. Yeah.
But there's a really complicated story to tell, and I think, Steve, the way you put it together, made it, because in stepwise fashion, it made it much easier to understand those issues. I think it was well done.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, really nice.
And it's simple. The punchline is simple. It was straightforward, and here's the punchline. And it's my initial thought is I'd be tempted to want to graphically display this, but this really gives you the data. You can look at the part, go over to the thing and say, holy cow, that's 500 days, and I think it lets you answer. The viewer can start to answer their own questions. They think, well, why did that circuit breaker take? Holy cow, it's 346 days. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Really nice.
That turned out pretty well. So I think in the end they were happy with it, and for the most part they were happy working back and forth with us. It was just very frustrating because they didn't understand that it was hard for them to get the fact that these aren't just simple PowerPoint slides. When I change something, it's a whole redo. So it was like, I think we got it down to maybe 800, but it was like $1,000 every time they changed something.
Do you think they were having difficulty then getting the data, and that's why it kept changing? I mean, your spreadsheet, giving them a spreadsheet like you did was a really good idea. Did they just have trouble getting the information to give it to you?
I think so, and I think that the person that was assigned to do this was sort of lacking in that kind of understanding. In other words, I think the data was there. I just don't think that unless you take a step back and get all of the data together at once, I think here's what would happen. The air inlet ductwork is what I'm working on. So let me go find out all the information on the air inlet ductwork. So then they would get that data. But they didn't think that data also has something to do with the CEMS building, right? So then they'd go, well, wait, now that ductwork couldn't have been here if they didn't have the building done yet. So now I got to go track down the building thing. And, I just think it was the kind of thing where we started this graphic before they had their information. And then this graphic brought to light the fact that some of their information had to be bad, right? Like it couldn't be installed before they had it. And,
It's a microcosm of the job.
I think that's a key part of it is this was being presented to the end client repeatedly, and they were identifying missing information or incorrect information that they had or gaps in their information. So I do think part of this is an example of how this actually helped both the attorneys and the end client understand strengths and weaknesses in their case as they were preparing for the hearing. So, but yes, the client was very, very pleased with all of this. It was a very complicated job. It went through a lot of iterations. They also imposed upon us very challenging cost parameters, which was a whole separate issue. But, Steve and everyone, met their demands repeatedly. So
here's another example of that problem solving thing, and the client not even realizing what a mess their data is, or what how involved their story is, until we force them down the path of regimenting it for the purpose of making the picture. Aberdeen was that way, Johnson was that way. And along the way, you reveal things about their story that makes them kind of get their ducks in a row. So it's one of those things that you can't. It's one of those intangibles that you can't put a price tag on. We end up having to charge for it. But how do you bring that out? It's like, we're making this thing work for you guys, and you're not realizing what it is you got until you go through this procedure, and then all of a sudden you got a wonderful tool that really puts a story together, but they had no idea what it took to do that. And how do we tell them we're going to charge for that?
Question? Just a quick question. Did anybody work out on this, the price difference, had all of the data been presented correctly to start with, and actually what it ended up costing because of the constant revisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my estimation, so this job essentially for the two pieces we did was about $44,000 US, and about $20,000 of that was the Kronos piece, the pre-permit, which obviously included the base fee. So this piece was about $24,000. I think, Steve, and correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection is that we probably could have finished this closer to about $15,000 just for this piece, but then because of all the back and forth over and over, it was another $9,000. Just like Steve had mentioned, it was just little bits here and there over the course of 6 weeks where they'd come back with changes, and it was like $1,000 a time.
Exactly.
On the other hand,
and we had to get approval. We had a pre-approved amount, and we had to get approval from them repeatedly to go higher.
But again, there's great value here. I mean, maybe it was an inconvenience maybe for us, and it made the budget go higher. But it was super great value for them to use this as a study tool to understand their case.
Yeah, but another thing too about this is that in the U.S., at least, I tend to find my clients are more resistant to, like, this was in AAA because they had a contractual agreement that they would go to arbitration instead of to court. And sometimes I find for domestic arbitration, clients are a little more resistant to this kind of a piece. But I think there's no doubt that this added significant value to them. So just for us in the U.S., the salespeople, I do think if we get resistance, this is a good piece for arbitration, but also both for the attorneys and the clients understanding the strengths and weaknesses of their case. And really for about $20,000, that's not a huge expenditure.
Right.
But through the process, Steve, one of the things that you really tried to do was to really try to educate the client in pulling edits. And Steve really made an effort to try and educate the client in best practices through this process. And it just wasn't, from the client's end, it just didn't seem to be clicking. But Steve was really making an effort to try to educate the client and get them to pull their edits so that the cost would stay down.
They were very pleased with us and Steve. And yes, that's a good point, Jeff. This client was not sophisticated or experienced with utilizing this kind of resource, and so it was a learning experience for her as well.
Right.
So I do think that.
For example, when I did the very first layout of this, and I had the list over here, and I had the laydown yard up here, and the data here, and the map over here, and then this whole bottom was going to be a timeline. When I sent them the first draft of that, and they got on board and they saw it and they loved it and everything, at that point, if they would have said, "Okay, we're going to stop, we're going to get all of our data in a spreadsheet or whatever," and then we're going to give it to Z-Axis. Had they done that, this would have been like a $10,000 piece at most, right? I mean, this is a fairly simple thing to put together from our end, except for all the changes. So if we could have done this in 5 versions instead of 30 versions, I think we would have saved the client $20,000 or something on it, at least $10,000 on it.
But the fact is, if they're going back and showing their client, and the client who's an expert in this more than they are, a content expert, that's going to happen. Like Shell. I mean, it's similar to what Alvin and Every. I mean, when people see it, then they go, "Oh no, we need this." Right. So it's just it's somewhat of a reality of what often happens, and that's why this is such a good tool. It makes people see it.
Yeah.
Can we show this?
Steve?
Are we
so
allowed?
I need to talk to them about that. Their hearing was in March, but I think it got delayed in the middle. So I need to just find out what ended up happening. But we will be able to show it. I just need to get clarity about whether the hearing is over.
Piece.
Yeah, and one other thing about Steve's handling of this, they also came to us originally wanting like 5 different pieces in December, and then that morphed into just 2 things, and Steve worked with them to identify that this was obviously the most beneficial to visualize, and I think clearly that, that was the case. That we helped them pinpoint that this was the one that was worth spending their money on.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah, nice job.
I would love to redo it and make it look beautiful. To me, it's kind of the look is pretty clunky, but yeah.
Yeah, but it goes in that category of things like Johnson and Aberdeen and those things that are real problem solvers, real revelations about the data that the client has, and you can't perceive that benefit. We've done these a few times, and we know kind of what wonderful things it'll do, but holy cow, getting the client on board with that, on trying to tell him that it's going to cost, what it's going to cost and what the hell he needs to do to feed the system is a big hurdle every time.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think one thing here too is they didn't allow us to work directly with the client, and I think that would have been helpful if we had been able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because as much as I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, the end client that I was working with on this she was fairly scatterbrained, and she was all over the place, and I know a lot of the changes in dates that had to be changed came from her. Or so, it just put us in this situation where it's in my best interest to say, okay, give me your data and please, please, please make sure it's correct, and please double check your work and that kind of stuff. I had to do that without being a jerk about it, even though it was very frustrating for me,
I like that you gave her a spreadsheet.
I wish I would have thought of it a month earlier.
Yeah.
Well, we learn.
Yeah.
So this was really good show and tell, guys. It was really good.
All right. I'm going to stop this recording right now. Is there any more coming?